Good afternoon and welcome. My name's Todd Keppel. I think everybody in the room knows me, but if anybody's watching this recording, I'm Todd Keppel, Director of the Klamath County Museum. I think everybody also knows where the restroom facilities are out in the lobby area. This is another in our series of free First Fridays. We're offering free admission to the museum on the first Friday of every month for the foreseeable future, just to make sure everybody has an opportunity to come visit our museums without cost being any kind of a hindrance at all. And so thank you for coming today. Our subject is some old rodeo photos. This is a stack of photos that, to be honest, they've been sitting around in the museum for we're not sure how long. It was, a big, thick stack of negatives. You'll hear more about it. So we decided it was time to go through those negatives and see what was on the images, and we were quite impressed. Photos from the early 1900s, I think mostly from around Klamath Falls, the Klamath Basin. And so the photography in those days, was much more challenging than photography today. But we've got some great images to share with you. So our presenter today is Katie Snow. Katie's been with us for several months now and is our registration technician. She's the one who went through the stack of negatives and scanned them all and selected ones for today's program. Also joining us today is Rod Kucera, and I'm so happy to be able to introduce him because he's introduced me a couple of times, and I'm always a little nervous whenever Rod gets up to introduce me because he talks about how we go way back to when I was at the Herald and News, and he was active in Farm Bureau, and he always claims he's got great stories on me. I don't really have anything on Rod other than he and his lovely wife, Jody, have been active in the community for a long time. They were active in the Farm Bureau Young Farmer program of some kind back in the day. Well, neither Rod nor I are very young anymore, but we're glad we're still on speaking terms, and Rod is a former rodeo contestant, bull rider, if I remember right, once upon a time, so we invited him to be our color commentator for today. So I'll turn you over now to Katie, and it'll be up to Katie and Rod to carry the day here. So Katie, come on up.
Thank you for coming. I'm very excited to show you the photos that we have for you today. Last year, I found a very interesting box, like Todd mentioned, of photos, photo negatives that had been sitting there for long enough to have a little pile of dust on the top. And that's part of my job here, is to find the boxes with a little pile of dust on top and figure out what's in them. But opening the box and going through the photos, I started to see, wow, these are really interesting photos. And so I was very excited to research them and be able to put together a little presentation so that we can share them with the public and with the people here in the Klamath Basin. The majority of the negatives that were in the box are from rodeos, and I'm sure you can tell just by looking at some of the photos that the horses and the people in them were not standing still to pose for their portrait, and they were moving quite fast, actually. And these are very impressive shots, especially with the limited high-speed photography that was available at the time. Most of these photos are from the 1910s and the 1920s. So the fact that the photographer was able to capture them so well and in such detail was very impressive. We don't know who took the photographs, but many of the photos have Miller Photo Co. labeled on the bottom. Miller Photo Company was a business here in Klamath Falls that had more than one photographer on staff. So it could have been any one of their photographers attending these events and taking the photos, but whoever it was extremely skilled in their craft. Research also found that Miller Photo Company was planning on taking a video with a motion picture camera that they had purchased for the 1914 Klamath Falls Rodeo. We don't know whatever happened to that footage. Unfortunately, it has been lost to time, but it must have been very exciting for people at the time to be able to go to a movie theater and see footage of their rodeo. There were many rodeo-like events and competitions here in the Klamath Basin, but the first one that was actually called a rodeo that I could find was the 1912 Elks Rodeo. And the event was a very big deal. People would advertise by wearing white when they went out, so the streets were full of people dressed all in white to advertise for this big event. And they actually had 2,000 people attend on the first day of the Elks Rodeo in 1912. We are going to take a look at some of the photos from that rodeo, but before we do, I want to include that women and members of local Native American tribes did participate in the first rodeo here in Klamath County. There were 3 races for white women, and there was 1 race for Indian men and 1 race for Indian women. Unfortunately, none of the pictures from these events were in our collection, but they did attend and they did participate in that rodeo. Now I'm pleased to introduce Rod Kucera. As Todd mentioned, he was a bull rider, and he rode for the Professional Rodeo Cowboys Association for 9 years. And he's going to go over some of the images from this rodeo and offer his commentary and expertise. Rod.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. That picture wasn't me that was up there. That was taken in Tacoma, Washington, and that bull I was on in that picture was actually raised in the Klamath Basin. Katie mentioned that the Indians were involved in the early 1912 rodeo, and they stayed involved. In fact, a famous horse came from the Klamath Marsh that was called War Paint. It was raised in the Klamath Marsh and then sold to the Christensen brothers, and was the bucking horse of the year 3 years in a row in the 50s. So the Native Americans had a heavy influence on rodeo here in the Klamath Basin also. Now here we are at the Elks Rodeo, one of the early Elks Rodeos, and we've got Dick Parker on a horse called Aeroplane. And you'll notice that that horse is really rearing in the front end. In fact, it could be just about to roll over backwards on him. And if it doesn't, I think he's coming off of that horse pretty quick. Go ahead, Katie. All right. Now you'll notice all the other horses and people in the arena around this bucking horse. The reason for that is in the early days, they would maybe put a jacket over the horse's head so he couldn't see while they put the saddle on and get ready for the cowboy to climb on. They didn't have chutes in the early days where they would run the bucking horse into and then open the gate and let him out. So this cowboy would have to crawl on this horse, and then they'd give him his rein, and then they'd give the horse's head by taking the blinders off. And then it's, here we go, boys, and that's probably right after they took the blinders off. And that, yeah, you can tell how damaged the photo is, but Katie's got a few like that in here. Go ahead, Katie. All right. Pickett riding Prescott, the horse called Prescott. And this is, let's see if we got what year this is. This is Bud Adams on this horse. The horse is Gaviota. That's a weird name for a horse, but it must have some kind of meaning. These rodeo stock contractors, like War Paint, they just named him that because no one could get past him, and he was such a tough horse. He was actually one of the horses in the herd up there in Klamath Marsh, but no one could ever stay on him, so they finally sold him to the Christensen brothers. But this one is quite a dust up here. He got a lot of dust going on. And now you see earlier pictures, they had their hat in their hand, but this guy is probably in the middle of the ride, because usually you wouldn't wave your hat around until you heard the whistle. And back then it was 10 seconds, and the modern rule is 8 seconds. So those guys used to have to go 10 seconds on that bronc, and that's saddle bronc there. Go ahead, Katie. Yeah, the way Judd rode White Pelican. White Pelican is the horse, and it doesn't look like he was very successful riding White Pelican. What he's doing there is something called grabbing for leather. So you get on the horse, and if they start to buck you off, you're trying to stay on that horse for everything you got, whether it's a rodeo or not, and he is trying to get any bit of that saddle he can to try to stay on that horse. Now, this is early, and I don't know if he would have been able to get back on, let's say, would he have gotten a score? Nowadays, he would not, because you have to have one hand up, and if that hand touches the animal, you get no score. And so maybe in the early days, he got a chance to climb back on by grabbing leather, but there you go. Katie, come on back up.
You might have noticed that some of those photos were damaged, particularly that one was unfortunately quite damaged. A lot of the photos were damaged when we pulled them out of the box. They had been sitting in these paper sleeves that they were wrapped in, and over time the weight of them all stacked on top of each other kind of fused the paper sleeve with the photo negative. Thanks to the efforts of our curator and myself, we were able to reveal some of the photos through very carefully removing the paper for some of them, but some of it was very stubborn and stuck around. So hopefully in the future, conservation efforts will be able to reveal more, but for now, you will see some photos that have some damage to them. The success of the rodeo in 1912, again, 2,000 people attended on the first day, and that would only increase their numbers as each day of the rodeo went through. And that success paved the way for more events like it. We have several more images in this collection of an Elks rodeo, but we also have images of a Klamath Falls rodeo, a Fort Klamath rodeo, and Indian Congress. I wanted to highlight this event, the 1929 Indian Congress, because so many pictures from this event were very interesting, and it was a very interesting event. 20,000 people attended this event. It had a rodeo, but it also had other things. They did a play, they did a fireworks show, but the rodeo itself was an all-Indian rodeo, and they had 2,000 Native Americans from several tribes were represented at this rodeo. So I'm going to go ahead and invite Rod Kucera back up here to go through some of these photos with you.
All right, thanks for having me back, Katie. That's interesting. I mentioned the tribes up in Fort Klamath. That's where I learned to ride bulls, up at a place called Saddle Mountain. Albert Summers had rodeos, and this is part of the huge influence of the Klamath tribe on the rodeo scene here in the Klamath Basin. And this is another one of those horses that's rearing. It's just about to go back. I don't see how it can come down from that. And if it does and bucks the other way, that guy's in trouble. But he's probably in trouble anyway. Now, if you'll notice, there's not a flank on that horse. So the flank goes around the back end of the horse, and they do it in the bulls too. And it's a rope on a bull, and they tighten it up, and it causes the animal to try to kick that rope off. And that's a big reason why these animals buck so much. But this horse doesn't have a flank on it. And this was 1929. But, you know, that's an incredible picture. This was a very good photographer. Go ahead, Katie. And the dust. Okay, this is probably where a horse has gone down. You can kind of see maybe a guy's arm. This horse probably ended up rolling over on this guy. So it's just what we call a wreck in the business. And every once in a while you will have an animal roll over the top of you. I had one come down on me, but he didn't roll over the top, so I guess I got lucky. Go ahead, Katie. Now this Was this at the Klamath County Fairgrounds, Katie? I'm not sure it is because it just doesn't look like the same arena. We see pictures later of the Klamath County Fairgrounds. But this is another saddle bronc rider, and that horse is bucking really well. And I think I do see a flank on this horse. You can see the rope around its back end there. Go ahead. This is Klamath County Fairgrounds. This is.
Forgive me for butting in, but that hill in the background, the little nibble on that hill, you can see that's north of town. And so, yeah, that's...
So this is the original Klamath County Fairgrounds.
And that's Old Fort Road, that little gap there in the middle. That's where Old Fort
Okay. Yeah, so the buck and chutes would be behind that horse in that picture. Yeah, and here's the racetrack. So this arena was still up, and it's the one I rode my first bull in 1976. I think they tore that down in the late 80s or early 90s. It's been a while. Ever since they built that event center, that arena has been gone. But that was a huge arena, and it rivaled the Pendleton Roundup grounds. And so it was really great that we had this Indian Congress event, and there was horse racing, and I know, go ahead, Katie, you've got pictures of teepees in here, and this is the open field, and it looks like it was grassy at this time. When I rode in it, they had it all disked up, and it was just soft dirt. And there's another saddle bronc rider. You can see his rein. Go ahead. All right, here they are. This is where we talk about getting them saddled up. Now, I don't see them have the jacket over his head. Okay, this is the wild horse race, and that would be the reason why. So in a wild horse race, usually there's 2 to 3 guys that one guy will hold the rope on the halter on the horse, the other guys will come up, one guy puts his arm around the horse's neck and holds it, the other guy gets the saddle on, tightens it up and gets on, and then they turn it loose, and the horse just goes. And hopefully it turns the right direction. You're the first one to cross the line. They also, these days, have wild cow milking. I grew up on a dairy. I won that event once. Go ahead. This one's interesting. For one thing, it's not a bronc. It's a jackass. I hope I didn't offend anyone. But he's riding bareback. If you look closely, he's not sitting on a saddle. And I couldn't tell. I thought maybe he's holding on with one hand. But a bareback rigging is something where it's a piece of leather with a handle on it that's almost like a suitcase handle, but it's not flexible. It's rigid. And you have your gloves and you put them on and you hold on for dear life. And go ahead, Katie. I'll have more comments about that in a little bit. Oh, that's the last one on that one. But there is another picture of a bareback rider that I'll comment further on later. All right, thanks, Jess. Yes. It was probably more likely one of the Cowboys' dogs. And it that dog. And they may have used them to kind of keep the horses riled up and bucking. I mean, the way that dog's coming at the horse, it could be that, in that big arena, one thing about that arena that a lot of cowboys didn't like is that it's so big that the animals would tend to just jump and kick straight, and you don't get a good score. You would on a bronc. If it's jumping high and kicking high and you're spurring good, you can get a good score. But on a bull, you want them to spin. And so an arena like that, just they look out there and they got a mile in front of them, so they just tend to jump and kick. So it's harder to get a good score. But we'll move forward. I might talk a little bit more about later how they train bulls these days. It's really interesting.
You can see on many of these pictures, you can see the writing on them. This has been very helpful in researching them because for many of the photos, they write the names of the person who's on the horse as well as the horse's names. And some of these horses have some great names with some very colorful language that I won't be reading to you. But I do want to point out that that horse's name is Not Now, which I thought was a wonderful name for a bucking horse that will buck you right off. Back here, I also want to point out the caption says, "There's a horse and men and that they're dust." Apparently there are supposed to be 2 people and 1 horse in that dust. And I stared at it for a while to try and get who was where. I might see like an arm in the corner. I see what might be a tail on the far left. But apparently there are 2 men and 1 horse in that cloud of dust. Yeah, there's another photographer getting a closer shot. I wish we had that picture. It would be great if we had the same event from 2 different angles, but unfortunately we don't. But he must have gotten a better picture of maybe where exactly the people are. Having the names of the people on the photos also helps me to match newspaper store names with the photos. And one of them that I found was Jesse Stahl, that I thought was especially interesting. He was a black man, and the first record that we have of a black person participating in rodeos out here in Klamath County was Jesse Watson in 1920. There could have been more from earlier dates, but no one just bothered to write it down. But this is the first we have that's written down. And he was described in this newspaper as a cowpuncher with a reputation for riding outlaw horses. In this specific collection, I was only able to identify 2 African-American men, Ty Stokes, who you see on the left, and Jesse Stahl, who you see on the right. The first record of Stahl competing in a Klamath County rodeo was in 1923. And these photos show him competing in the 1923 rodeo as well as the 1924 rodeo. And records show that he won many events in the Klamath County rodeos. And with each new newspaper that would come out to advertise the rodeo, they would mention if he was coming or not and how many wins he'd had in the past. And there are some more interesting stories about him, but first I want to invite Rod Kucera back up here to talk about the next 2 photos.
So this is the bareback photo. In the first photo, when I was going through this with Katie last week, I couldn't tell if he just had one hand down and one hand in the rigging, but obviously by this photo, they did ride with 2 hands. And sometime, this is apparently 1923, I did a little research on it, and it was in the late 20s when what was called the Turtle Association, I'm not sure why they named it that, but that was the Professional Rodeo Cowboys. That was the grandfather of the PRCA. The Turtles Association. Not sure why they called it that. But they made the rules for professional rodeos. And in the late 20s, they changed it to where the bareback riders had to use 1 hand. And then as they come out of the chute, and it looks like that horse does not have a flank either. But when they come out of the chute, as the horse turns out of the chute, they've got their spurs on, and their spurs are loose rowels, and they've got to, what they call it, mark them out. So with their feet, they reach forward to the shoulders of the horse, and they lean back with 1 hand like this, and they start spurring. And if they don't get them on that first jump, they get disqualified. So the rules changed significantly in the bareback riding in the late 20s. So it was interesting to see these early photos. And, I don't know, that I suppose they still had the horse snubbed up and had it blindfolded and then turned it loose. And then it probably timed, you had to do it for a certain amount of time. Go ahead. Another Jesse Stahl, bulldogging. So last week when I was talking with Katie, she goes, "What does bulldogging mean?" Well, these days they call it steer wrestling. And it's a timed event, so the cowboys have to back into the chute, and the steer is in a chute that's got a gate that opens, then the steer runs out. But there's also can be a penalty in this. There's something called a barrier rope. Now the barrier rope goes in front of the horse, and it's tied to a little string that is released when the steer gets a certain distance away. The string releases, the barrier rope slips back, and the horse can run out. If the horse breaks the string, it causes a penalty. So being a timed event, when the chute opens, the clock starts. If the horse does not hit the barrier, then when the cowboy runs up, he dives off the horse. Usually right-handed guy's going this way. And he gets his arms around the horns, lets his horse keeps running, his feet go in front, he's sliding along, and then he gets the nose of the steer, reefs it over and gets the steer just like that. And if I remember right, the same Jesse Stahl character, maybe a year or two later, somehow lost a finger bulldogging. But he came to the next rodeo the next weekend and wanted to try to get in, and they tried to not let him in, but I think, did he still get in? He still got in the rodeo, because cowboys are tough, that's why. And apparently Jesse Stahl had a certain amount of fame if they were using him for advertising. And so that's a great photo. Go ahead.
Thank you. Isn't he great? It's been so fun to learn more about. I've attended rodeos before, but I've never heard about them from someone who has competed in them. So I'm so glad he was able to attend today. Yes, Jesse Stahl did lose a finger bulldogging. He actually had 2 injuries on record. The first one was at Klamath Falls Rodeo in the 1923 rodeo. He got hurt on his leg somehow while he was on a bucking horse. It could have been that one there. Then he was reported to be limping afterwards, but he still came back the next year. And he came back the year after that when at another rodeo, it wasn't in Klamath Falls, but it was one nearby. Let me see if I have it written down. But anyway, it was one nearby. And while steer wrestling, the horn of the bull gouged his finger out. And so he had it all bandaged up and decided to attend the Klamath Falls Rodeo only 10 days later. He hid the injury while he signed up because they wouldn't let him compete if they knew that he was injured. And he gave what was reported as one of the most sterling riding exhibitions in the rodeo, despite being in, I imagine, a lot of pain while competing. Women were involved in Klamath County rodeos from the beginning. There were women's races and other similar events that they would have participated in, like this one. This is a cowgirl race at an Elks rodeo. Unfortunately, the photographer didn't put down the year or the names of the women participating, so I'm not able to identify any of them, but it seems to be a very intense race that they're undergoing. In fact, although there are photos of women in this collection, very few of them are named. Mostly it was just pictures like this of them on horseback. We don't know who they are, but considering they are among other photos of rodeos, it can be assumed that they were perhaps rodeo competitors saddling up for the day. The only woman in this collection that was named was Vera McGinnis. She was a trick rider. As you can see here, she's doing what's called Roman riding with one foot on each horse. I wouldn't even attempt to stand on a horse if both feet were on one horse. I don't know how she's doing it with 2 different horses, but it's very impressive. We have more photos of her. There she is dipping on a horse. I don't know how she's doing that. I don't know how she's not falling off, but she was very famous out in California and was invited to a couple of Klamath County rodeos to come and compete. In the 1914 edition on May 25th of the Evening Herald, this is how they described her arrival. Miss Vera McGinnis, considered one of the greatest horsewomen in the West, arrived last night and will at once begin training horses to use in exhibition and work at the Elks Rodeo. I had a lot of fun digging into this photo collection and getting to be able to research all these amazing photos. I'd like to again thank Rod Kucera for his help. And I'd like to mention that for further reading, we do sell this edition of the Shaw Historic Library, and it does include a story about the first rodeo here in Klamath County and that famous horse that Rod mentioned. As more collections like this one are uncovered and researched, and as we continue to dig into the past, I think photos like the ones in this collection in particular help us to humanize people. The photos in this collection do not just show the pretty, beautiful, most aesthetic shots. There's dirt flying, there's dust clouds, people are falling off. They show both victories, like the one on the left, he's calling his time after steering that bull down, and they show falls and defeats, like the one on the right. Those two guys are just hitting the dirt there. But it shows that they were human, and I think it reminds us that each person that you see in these photos lived a life that was just as real and complicated as yours and mine, with triumphs and defeats of their own. Thank you.